Hello, everyone. My name is Augustin Fu, and I'm very glad to have an opportunity to share with you some of my research over the years. Today, I'll be talking about digital ad fraud in 2020. As you know, digital advertising and digital programmatic advertising has been around for many years, and this problem of ad fraud has also been around for many years and actually has grown in recent years. So what I'll be talking about today is I'll level set a little bit and give a little bit of background on ad fraud itself, and then we'll address some of the common questions like how big is ad fraud, why hasn't it been solved already, and what can marketers do about it. So let's start from the very beginning. What is ad fraud? Just as a quick recap. Ad fraud is very basically ads shown to bots and not to humans. So when digital advertising first started, advertisers bought and placed ads on publishers' websites because those publishers had human audiences going to visit them. And so the advertisers would get their ads in front of humans just like they would in the offline world on magazines or TV ads and things like that. But in digital, the rise of programmatic has also enabled bad guys to set up fake websites and use bots to look at the pages. So now the assumptions that advertisers make that their ads are being shown to humans are no longer always valid. So on the right-hand side, just a very simple depiction, this is what ad fraud is. So bots are looking at web pages. So when the ads load, they're being shown to bots and not to humans. So it's basically not what the advertiser thought they were paying for. And in digital, there are two primary kinds of ad fraud. There's impression fraud and click fraud. You've probably heard of both of these. And this is really based on the two largest buckets of digital ad spend. So the vast majority of digital spending goes into display ads and video ads. That's the CPM model. And then there are also some ads that are placed on a CPC, cost per click model. So based on these two buckets of digital ad spend, which collectively account for more than 90% of all digital spending, this is where the bad guys also focus their efforts. So the two main kinds of fraud are CPM fraud and CPC fraud. And how easy is it for the bad guys to commit ad fraud? Pretty straightforward. You can almost think of it as a three-step process. So the first step is for them to set up fake websites. And here's a screenshot of one that has literally no content on it, but many, many ads, as you can see. So the purpose of these sites is not really to attract human audiences and give them something useful to read. Its sole purpose is to carry as many ads as possible and generate as many ad impressions as possible. Now, then you might be wondering if these are fake sites that no one goes to, how are they generating these ad impressions? Well, there's a second step. The second step is to buy fake traffic. So instead of humans going to the site and causing the page to load, they're basically using bots, which are software programs that just repeatedly load the web pages. So once they load the web pages, the ad impressions also load. Now, you'd probably be wondering, why aren't those bots detected? Well, these bots are advanced enough that they can basically trick all the detection, the fraud detection. So what you see in this close-up is that there's IAS compliant traffic, forensic compliant traffic, double verify compliant traffic. What that means is that these bots that create traffic to these sites are able for sure to get by all of these detections. So they get marked as valid. So now when you have all this traffic loading pages and generating ad impressions on these fake sites, you now have billions and billions of ad impressions to sell. And conveniently, there's plenty of ad exchanges that are more than happy to help the fake websites sell that traffic and sell those ad impression. They call it ad impression inventory. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that some of these sites and apps are easily selling 1 billion impressions per day. These are daily impression numbers, not even monthly or annual. These are daily impressions. So they're able to sell massive quantities of impressions through the ad exchanges. So again, this gives you a sense of how big the ad fraud problem is. Now, obviously, the question is ad fraud bad, or why is it bad? it should be pretty obvious to everyone, but let me just show it in a chart. For every dollar that the advertiser spends, a very small portion of it actually makes it through to the publishers. So when when an advertiser pays a dollar, in the old days, it would go to the publisher and they would display the ad on the website. But now, with all this ad tech, advertising technology in between, it makes it easier for the bad guys to siphon the money out of the ecosystem. So the bad guys are using technology to steal more and more of these ad dollars out of the ecosystem. So less and less of that dollar is actually making it through to the publisher for the purpose of displaying the ad. And the other problem that we've seen recently is that these ad dollars, these big digital budgets from marketers and advertisers, are actually going to fake sites and fake news sites and hate sites and disinformation outlets. So there's many examples now documented over the years, including the one example on the left-hand side, where there are local news sites that are entirely fake, and they've been using ad tech to monetize, which means they're making money by siphoning off those advertising dollars from big brands. And then more recently, with the coronavirus news, there's also disinformation sites that are spreading fake news or fake information regarding the coronavirus. And those sites are also monetizing and taking money out of the digital ecosystem, money that comes from big advertisers. And again, on the right-hand side, you'll see a number of these technologies from Google technology, from Facebook, from Amazon. All of these ad tech platforms and technologies are enabling these sites to make money from big brands' advertising dollars. And all the while this is happening, the industry trade associations have been downplaying fraud, and this has been happening for years. So if you just look at a few of these examples, the ANA in 2019, TAG in 2019, and Group M, all of them are saying fraud is very low. So for example, TAG is saying fraud is IVT, invalid traffic, is 1.41%, and Group M is saying it's about 1 to 3% worldwide. So even if you read from the trade presses that fraud is low, it's not that ad fraud is actually low. It's because the fraud detection is not detecting it, and the trade associations are using those technologies to downplay the problem of fraud. And their motive is to keep everyone happy and keep everyone spending. So again, think for yourselves. Don't trust the information that's coming out of even the large trade associations. So what we've seen over the years is kind of captured in this cartoon that I had drawn in 2018. So in a collaboration, we kind of drew this picture that shows that the marketers are kind of covering their ears so that they hear no ad fraud, right? They actually want to keep spending, so they'd rather not find out that there's a bunch of ad fraud. The exchanges and ad networks are saying, there's no ad fraud. Don't worry about it. Trust us. We're certified and we don't see anything. There's no fraud on our exchanges. So they speak no ad fraud. And finally, the verification technology, you can almost say they can see no ad fraud, because on the one hand, they're looking at the ants, as you can see over here. They're literally picking out the lowest level, least sophisticated bots, and they're able to detect those. And so while they're looking at the ants, the bot right behind them is taking big money out of the open vault. So this is a vault that gets refilled with $350 billion of digital spending by the big brands worldwide. And the bots and the fraudsters are basically taking all that money out of the vaults. So this is a cartoon that kind of captures it. And this was in 2018. We had to update it for 2019, and we're in 2020, and this is all still happening. So how do we know that a lot of the digital spend is actually useless? So we don't necessarily even have to say it's due to fraud, but there's a lot of waste and useless digital marketing going on right now. So how do we know? There's a couple of examples, starting with this one. In 2018, P&G cut 200 million out of their digital spend. Now, again, for P&G, they spend about 2 billion in digital, so this is about a 10% cut. But when they did that, there was no change in business outcomes. So just think about that for a minute. They cut 200 million from their digital budgets and saw no change in business outcomes. So whether we attribute that to fraud or supply chain inefficiencies or simply bad digital marketing, whatever it is, it's $200 million that was spent or that would have been spent and would not have driven any incremental business outcomes. Here's another example. Chase cut their programmatic reach by 99%. The way they did that is instead of having their ads being shown on 400,000 websites, they cut it down to just 5,000. So that's a 99% decrease in reach. And they too saw no change in business outcomes. So in this case, why were their ads being shown on 400,000 websites when there was no incremental business outcomes anyway, right? And then it starts to beg the question, was that reach real reach, right? So a lot of brand advertisers are seeking reach and frequency. So they're kind of applying the same mentality from TV advertising and bringing that mentality into digital. However, the reach may not actually be real human reach. You might be reaching just bots, right? So when we have all of these long tail sites that have no sizable human audiences, who are their audiences? It's basically bots. So your ads are being shown on hundreds of thousands of websites, not to humans, but to bots. Right, so keep that in mind when you think about the reach that you're getting or actually not getting in digital. Another example that was recently revealed was the case of Uber. So in their rise, they basically did a lot of digital marketing to get more installs of the Uber app. However, when an analyst looked into this more closely, they found that when they cut their digital budgets by 80%, there was no change in the rate of installs of their app. And you can kind of understand this by common sense. A lot of humans would have installed the Uber app because they wanted to install the Uber app, not because they clicked on an ad for the Uber app and then installed it afterwards. So the fraud that was happening here is what we call app install fraud, where the bad guys were either installing the Uber app on fake devices or stealing credit, taking credit for an install that would have happened anyway. So in this case, by cutting off 80% of their digital spend, they saw that the installs continued, and therefore a lot of the installs that they were paying for before was completely fraudulent. Finally, in digital ad tech, when there are all these programmatic middlemen, you can actually see from these two studies done by the ANA, Association of National Advertisers, and the WFA, that so that's the World Federation of Advertisers, that between 30 to 40% of the dollar actually makes it through to showing of the ad. And that means that 40 to 60% of every dollar that the advertiser spends is taken up as kind of the middleman fees, right? These are tolls, these are taxes that go straight into the pocket of the middlemen. The middlemen are there to maximize their own profit. So whatever they can extract out of the value chain or the supply chain, that's how they make their revenues and their profits. So again, for marketers spending in digital programmatic, just know that a very small fraction of your dollar actually goes through to what we call working media, to displaying of your ad. So the next question is obviously, how big is ad fraud? So let me let you be the judge. So let me show you a few data points that have been published over the years. So this first example comes from 2015, where AppNexus and AdExchange purged their own exchange. They purged the impressions from 260 billion per month to 20 billion per month. So that was a decrease of 92%. So they didn't purge 9% of their volume. They didn't purge 19% of their volume. They purged 92% of their volume. So let's use that as a data point of to answer the question, how big is ad fraud? The next example comes again over the years. We've seen every single year there's been the next largest ever botnet that has been discovered, documented, and disclosed. So in 2016, the largest ever was called MethBot. In 2017, the largest ever botnet was called HiveBot. In 2018, the largest ever was called Eve. And so over the years, every single year, we see the largest ever botnet. And that begs the question, will we continue to see these largest ever? So again, these botnets are committing fraud on the order of millions and millions of dollars, and they're able to steal those budgets out of the ecosystem. And all of these dollars are coming from the digital spending from the big brands. And then here's yet another example. Pretty much every other month, we see another example of fraud committed by, in this case, mobile apps, right? So millions of apps on millions of phones. Sometimes there's an example of a flashlight app, an alarm clock app, emoji keyboard app that are simply loading ads in the background, right? So no human actually sees those ads, but when you have millions of these apps installed on millions of people's phones, they can be committing continuous ad fraud in the background by loading ads. Right. And so here's two more examples. These date back to 2017, where only a handful of apps installed on many, many devices can cause 1 billion fake impressions or up to 30 billion fake impressions per minute. So these are at scale examples of fraud being committed using mobile apps. And then there's other types of fraud that are not detected by normal IVT detection. So the fraud detection is basically tuned to look for bots hitting web pages. But in this case, as you can see, these are pop unders, these are page redirects, and these are other forms of fraud that are not detected by bot detection technologies. So here's just one example where this one vendor, just one vendor, is selling 125 billion page redirects per month. So think of these as page views. And they basically have very large redirect circles that just keep going in infinite loops. So in this case, if you can generate 125 billion page views per month and you stick 4 ads on each page, that's about 1 trillion ad impressions that are created fraudulently for the purpose of ripping off big brands' ad dollars. And these techniques are being used across the board by fraudsters to steal millions and millions of dollars out of the advertising ecosystem. And then here's one more example where when we're talking about mobile networks, this study from Tune, which is a mobile attribution company in 2017, showed that when they looked at 700 mobile ad networks, the top 8 were 100% fraud. So we're not talking about 10% fraud or even 20% fraud. We're talking 100% fraud. And then if you take the next 30 networks or so, all of them were greater than 50% fraud. So in this case, the question is whether fraud is low or whether fraud is high, right? Just look at the evidence. And then there's one final example. So when we talk about audiences and targeting audience segments and things like that, here's a company called a data management provider. This company is called Lotame. They voluntarily purged 400 million user profiles that they knew to be bots. So basically what's happening here is the bots are visiting websites and building up profiles so that they appear to be whatever segment the marketers want to target, because they actually earn higher CPMs when the marketers try to target them with ads. So in this case, if you think about it, 400 million user profiles is greater than the entire population of the US. So these were all bot profiles that this data management provider voluntarily purged from their exchange. All right. So let me leave you with a question. Is fraud closer to 9% or is fraud closer to 99%? You decide. Probably most of you will say, okay, it's probably somewhere in between 9% and 99%. Okay, so now let's take a closer look to see why there are these discrepancies and why there are these arguments about how big fraud is. So it comes down to the fact that fraud detection technology doesn't detect the fraud. So this has been the subject of my research over the years. When we look at fraud detection reports, I'll just use one simple example. The same fraud detection vendor used by a publisher and the same fraud detection vendor used by a marketer, when they measure the same campaign on the same website, they come up with different numbers. So why is that the case? The problem is that when they're used by the publisher, the tag is loaded on the page. When that fraud vendor is used by the marketer, the tag is in the ad iframe. So that just illustrates that depending on the placement of the tag, the measurements can be entirely different. The outcomes are entirely different. And so when you talk about black box fraud detection technology, where they don't actually tell you, they just tell you a number, here's the fraud that we detected, but they don't tell you how they measured it, that becomes a problem because no one can verify and no one can understand how they detected it. So let me show you a few examples of where fraud detection technology is not actually detecting the fraud. So here's an example where a relatively mainstream publisher, or one that you would expect to be mainstream, Newsweek, is actually using code to trick the viewability measurement. So they're using JavaScript code to trick the JavaScript detection by the viewability measurement vendors so that all of their inventory gets marked as viewable. So think of it this way. In the industry where we're saying we only want to buy viewable ads, if you have a non-viewable ad, it's kind of like a rotten apple that you can't sell. So that's the reason they're using malicious code to trick the viewability measurement so that everything gets marked as viewable. So what used to be rotten apples that they couldn't sell are now marked as fresh apples, even though they aren't, but now they can sell it. So that's why some of these sites who want to cheat can find technologies and code to help them trick the detection so that now they can sell bot inventory, non-viewable inventory, or otherwise fraudulent inventory as if they were valid. And then just have a look at these lists of sites that we found when we looked at some of the data. So do any of these sites look like sites that humans would ever go to? Right? No human's ever going to type that in to go to that website. But yet we see these domains in our data, and these are domains that carry millions and millions of ads. And then on the right-hand side, in the third column, you'll see names of mobile apps. Again, would any human go and download these mobile apps? So these are fake sites and fake apps whose sole purpose is to commit as much ad fraud as possible before they're caught. And then once they're caught and they can no longer make money, the bad guys have 100 other sites ready to go that they can just turn on and continue making money. So these are just a smattering of domains and apps that have gotten through fraud detection and are continuing to monetize. And here's an example where when you talk about the segments that the ad tech companies are selling, there's a company selling verified bots and verified humans. And if you just kind of eyeball that donut chart and look at the percentage that's marked as dark blue versus the percentage that's marked as dark red, you can see there's no difference between what they call verified humans versus verified bots, right? You would expect that there's some kind of difference, but we can actually see no difference whatsoever. And furthermore, there's no difference between these two segments that they're selling and a control where there was no targeting done whatsoever, right? So these three donut charts are virtually identical. So that basically tells you that the fraud detection technologies are not working the way they're supposed to work. They're not able to detect the fraud. They're not able to detect the bots. And furthermore, when they focus on detecting bots, they're going to find just the bots. And so bot fraud is now only a very small percentage of the overall ad fraud that is happening. So if you're only looking for bots, that's what you'll find. So on the left-hand side, you'll see bot detection detects roughly the 1% bot fraud. But they're missing other kinds of fraud, like I mentioned before, that could account to many, many times more, right? So in this case, if they're only detecting the 1% bot fraud, they're missing the 57% of other kinds of fraud. So remember the example where I talked about the flashlight app, the keyboard app that's loading ads in the background. Those are all not detected as bots. Therefore, bot detection misses all of that. So they're missing the majority of the fraud. Okay, so now that we've established that the detection technologies are not good enough to catch the fraud, we really can come down to the realization that ad fraud is really not a tech problem that can be solved by throwing more tech at it, right? And that's what's been happening over the years. Ad fraud is basically an incentives problem because pretty much every single party in the supply chain has no incentive to solve fraud. In fact, some of them have an incentive to keep fraud going. So let me just pick off a few things on this slide. The fraud detection technology companies rely on fraud to continue so that they can keep getting paid for doing the detection, right? So they actually want fraud. In fact, they rely on fraud to continue. The sellers, for example, these fake sites, they actually make more money by using bots to cause more traffic on their site. So they want fraud to continue. They're the ones committing the fraud. The ad exchanges and the agencies actually both make more money the more volume or the more budget that passes through their systems. So as you can see, most of these parties have an incentive to keep the fraud going, and they have no incentive to solve the fraud. And finally, probably the most non-intuitive would be the buyers. So these are the big advertisers. Why would they want the fraud to continue? Because it's their money that they're spending. Wouldn't they want to stop the fraud? So in a lot of the cases that I've seen, the buyers actually want to continue buying large quantities. So where do you get these super large quantities? You get it in the long tail sites that they buy through programmatic exchanges. So not only do they want large quantities to buy, they also want low CPMs. So compared to buying from a mainstream publisher like New York Times or Wall Street Journal, where the CPMs are high, where can you get rock bottom cheap CPMs? Right, you can get those on exchanges. So the buyers are actually part of the problem as well when they demand very large quantities of ad impressions to buy at very low CPMs. So in this case, this is why I'm saying ad fraud is an incentives problem. So as a marketer, let me now wrap up by saying, okay, so despite all this bad news about ad fraud, what can marketers actually do? So the answer is don't depend on anyone else, right? Don't depend on the exchanges to solve the fraud for you. Don't depend on the publishers or the websites to solve the fraud for you. Don't depend on the fraud detection companies to detect the fraud for you because they're all incentivized otherwise. So what should marketers do? Marketers should put their own analytics in place. They should put their own measurement in place so that they can actually see the relative quality of where their ads are being displayed. So in this case, this is just to show you a very simplistic example where you can very easily see blue means good, red means bad. So blue means humans and red means bots. So if you are able to measure the different sources where your ads are running, you can actually see how drastically different the quality is, right? Ranging from the one at the top where there's a lot of blue and very little red to the one on the bottom where there's very little blue and more red. Right, so you can now see the relative quality of the different placements for your ads. And then once you can see this, then the very simple action would be to allocate more of your budget to sources where there's more humans, right? So in this case, this will be the large publishers, the mainstream publishers that have large human audiences, right? And then allocate less of your dollars to those sites or those sources that have higher red, right? And this way you can start to avoid some of the ad fraud while your campaign is still running. And then the other kind of adage that people should know about is you really get what you pay for. Right? And so when you're buying low cost or super low cost ad impressions, you're probably not getting your ads in front of a lot of humans. Right? So in this case, when you look at sources 1 through 5, you'll see a very drastic difference. Source 1 has a lot of blue, source 5 has very little blue. So even though source 5 is very inexpensive, you're actually not getting your ad in front of humans. So when you calculate the cost of getting your ad in front of a human, it actually ends up being much higher. In this example, 11 times higher, right? And so we realize, most marketers I'm sure realize that if you start with better media, you're going to get better outcomes, right? So if you start in case A with ads shown to more humans, you're going to get more arrivals on your site, meaning they click through from the ad and come to your site. And when they get there, more of them are going to convert. And you can see in these donut charts, there's a lot of blue that actually ends up converting. And then in B, when you start with lower cost media or lower quality media, your conversions are also going to hurt. Okay. So this is a quick visual just to show you, if we compare across 4 different kinds of display sources, you can see very different quality, and then that results in very different outcomes. So just as a quick recap, Don't assume that fraud is low or that it doesn't affect your campaigns. Stop paying for black box fraud detection companies that can't explain to you why they mark something as fraud or something as not fraud. The third is examine your own analytics or do your own measurement so that you can actually see something, see something when it's strange, you can dig deeper. And then finally, buy from good publishers' sites that have real human audiences. Remember the adage, you get what you pay for. And finally, the more direct that you buy from good publishers, the less middlemen fees absorb your dollar. So hopefully this is helpful to the marketers in the room as they consider continuing to spend in digital channels. There's ways to detect the fraud, mitigate it while your campaigns are still running so that you can actually derive better business outcomes. Thank you very much.